Memory is a fascinating topic to discuss. This is especially true when it comes to the memorialization of historical events. Who picks and chooses what is remembered, taught, and celebrated? When discussing the role of Kansas in the Civil Rights Movement, the Supreme Court case of Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka is often thought of. However, the all but forgotten Coffeeyvile Race Riot of 1927 is an example of Black armed resistance against mob mentality and the almost lynching of 3 innocent men that we shouldn't forget. Welcome to Kansas History, a Journal of the Central Plains podcast, a collaborative project of the Kansas Historical Foundation and Department of History at Kansas State University. I am your host, Lisa Caitlin Highsmith, and today I'm joined by Geoffrey Newman, who will be discussing his article, Forgetting Strength, Coffeyville, the Black Freedom Struggle, and Vanished Memory. Geoffrey Newman is a PhD candidate in American Studies at the University of Kansas, where he focuses on race, ethnicity, immigration, labor, and 20th century historiography. He earned a master's degree in history from the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and a master's in journalism from Northwestern University. He has also taught American history at the Art Institutes International, Kansas City, and Lenexa. He is fascinated by topics of memory and erasures in history. Hello, Mr. Newman. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, Lisa. Glad to be here.
Mr. Newman, if you could you tell our listeners what originally drew you to this research?
What drew me to the Coffeyville story was I had been going through at the Kansas Public Library about 5 years of microfilms for the Kansas City Call, the African American newspaper in Kansas City. And it was just depressing. It was in the 1920s. When I was looking at it, there was just lynching after lynching after lynching after riot after lynching. Then all of a sudden, there was this Coffeyville story where nobody was lynched. Apparently, people that were involved in it were able to drive off a lynch mob and able to drive off a mob that attempted to burn down the African American section of town.
Many people, when they think of lynching, they automatically think of hangings, but in its most basic definition, it is a public execution of someone without a trial.
Usually we think of it in terms of hanging and a mob that is involved in hanging. And the thing that struck me in looking at the history in the 1920s, which has been called the nadir, the low point in race relations in this country, is that lynching was very, very common. There is a museum that recently opened about lynching to commemorate the names of the victims, to recover that memory from history. And the fact that it was so commonplace, it just struck me as just awful. When I teach American history, while I don't show pictures of an actual lynching, I might show a picture of just the feet of the victim. There were postcards and like little girls, in picnic outfits watching the bodies.
This isn't something particular to Kansas, though. Lynch mobs happened all over the country, correct?
What struck me is that how commonplace lynching was as a technique of terror and subjugation and defense of white supremacy. A lynching around the time of the Atlanta race riot so impressed W.E.B. Du Bois because he was walking by a store window in Atlanta and saw the knuckles of a lynching victim that were on display. People took souvenirs.
In the context of your article, can you set the stage for our listeners to help them understand what it was like living in Coffeyville in the 1920s?
Coffeyville was a boomtown in the 1920s. It had a thriving brick industry. You can see bricks all around, the state. It had several glass factories. It was just a very humming, small industrial city that was economically viable. It was a segregated city by a set of railroad tracks of the Katy Railroad. West of the tracks was where white folks lived. East of the tracks is where black folks lived. That area east of the tracks is also an area that was more likely to flood. And newspapers would describe, houses on the west side that were white. They would describe, quote, Negro cottages on the east side.
Can you set up for us what exactly leads to the Coffeyville Race Riot of 1927? What is the story for our listeners who haven't had a chance to previously read your article?
It's interesting that the trigger is like the trigger of so many lynchings throughout America in this particular era. There was an allegation of rape of a white woman, well, specifically white high school girls. It really began with two girls that knocked on a neighbor's house at 2 a.m. who were yelling, quote, "Negroes raped us." The police had set up roadblocks. They had arrested African-American motorists. They had detained an African-American teenager who had a woman's compact because they felt, this is a potential suspect. They sent for bloodhounds from Kansas City. The newspapers got wind of the story and started publishing extra editions about the rape of these two high school girls. What had happened, apparently, and this is where it's difficult to reconcile different accounts of what happened between the mainstream white newspapers and the African-American newspapers such as the Kansas City Call and the Chicago Daily Defender. The white newspapers went with the story of, quote, "Negroes raped us." And the African-American newspapers right away kind of got into the idea that this doesn't make sense. How could 3 African-Americans be undetected in the middle of the night, move across that railroad tracks, move into, about 10 blocks into the white neighborhood and move into the house? Let me explain a little bit about this house. It's called the Mooney House because of Julia Mooney and her family. Julia had lived in this house with her family up until about a year or so before this incident occurred in March of 1927. The family then moved to Lenapaw, Oklahoma, where her father was postmaster. They rented out the house to a Studebaker salesman named Ira Kennedy and his family. Then his family moved about a month or so before the incidents occurred. Julia then moved back into the house because she wanted to graduate from Coffeyville High School rather than the little dinky high school in Lenapaw, Oklahoma. She would occasionally invite other girls to be there with her overnight. And this kind of gets into the whole trope of gender in the way things were presented in the 1920s. The idea of 2 women alone in a house was in the minds of a lot of people, and particularly the newspaper writers that viewed this as an interesting story. The idea of 2 women alone was like inviting trouble. The role of women was drastically changing in the post-World War I era. Women got the vote about 7 years earlier. Young women in particular were pushing this change in the role of women in being more active in society. The 1920s is when we started to have the development of a youth culture. And while it started at the college level, it affected people in high school as well. You can see this from looking at high school yearbooks from the era. I mentioned segregation, and by the way, African American students had their own separate page in the high school yearbooks of the 1920s of the Coffeyville High School. So women had gotten the vote earlier, and their more active role was contested a lot in society. Flappers were viewed as sexually promiscuous. And, this is a problem of prejudice that occurs really throughout history and in the way patriarchy perceives young women.
So what did the competing newspapers say happened in the house?
Okay, so these 2 were in the house. And in this particular house, there was this allegation that they were raped. The African American newspapers, in interviewing the community, pretty quickly came to the recognition the rapists were probably white high school students that they knew. As a result of the rapes, within 24 hours, you had this mob mentality that was stirred up by newspapers that occurred in Coffeyville. The bloodhounds that I had mentioned earlier had traced the scent of a suspect from the house which was the crime scene through the African-American stores on 7th Street over into the African-American neighborhood. A mob in 200 cars, a lot of Model Ts, a white mob, followed the bloodhounds, and the police arrested 3 suspects. The reason the bloodhounds traced this trail is because there was probably a delivery of liquor to the house for the 2 girls and whoever the boys were that they were having a party with there. What police found were basically sheets that had tar on them, as if someone had been using blackface. Let's assume that the owner of an African-American restaurant and saloon, had been involved in bootlegging. Bootlegging was a very common crime in 1927. If you look at the docket in the Montgomery County Court, it seems like 2/3 of the cases involved prohibition violations and bootlegging. So the dogs had traced this scent over into the African-American store and then over into the African-American neighborhood. Police arrested 3 suspects. They brought them over to the City Hall, and the second floor of City Hall was a jail. And you can still see it today in the old City Hall. You see the bars up there. The white mob, stirred up by these stories in the Coffeyville Daily Journal and the Coffeyville Morning News, this mob surrounded the City Hall, broke all the windows in the City Hall trying to get in to get the suspects. 2 of the suspects had been questioned and released secretly through a back entrance. The deputies fought off the mob. They threw tear gas grenades at the mob. A fire truck was brought up, and the mob cut the hoses so the hoses couldn't be used against them. And the deputies hid Curtis Smith, who is a barber that may well have delivered the liquor, up in the cupola of City Hall. And then there was a fire alarm. The fire engine took off, and the police spread the rumor that Curtis Smith had gone out with the fire engine, that he had been taken to safety. He was later escorted out of the City Hall when the mob had gone on to other things. They were very angry that they weren't able to get hold of the suspects. I mean, lynching, as you said, was viewed by the white patriarchy at the time as a group effort at justice. About a quarter of the mob broke free from City Hall and headed across the street to try to burn down the African-American shop. Now remember, this is about 6 years after the burning of the Greenwood section of Tulsa. So all this was very fresh in the minds of people. And Tulsa is only about an hour and a half or a 2-hour drive in your Model T from Coffeyville.
This mob sounds incredibly dangerous. How exactly were they stopped?
And this is where the newspapers differ. The Kansas City Call says that Robert Liggins, essentially a deputy police officer, held back 60 men with a gun and with a threat. Some of the other newspapers say it was 2 people that did this. In any case, it gave the African Americans in the restaurant and pool hall owned by Napoleon Anderson a chance to see what was going on at City Hall and to get their guns. There was gunfire of 15 or 20 minutes across the street. African Americans filed out of Napoleon Anderson's pool hall and fired back at whites in the mob. The whites in the mob kind of sheltered themselves in doorways, and they fired shots from what was a white-owned business on the other side of the street, the commercial hotel, and some of those shots hit Napoleon Anderson. Now, Napoleon Anderson is an interesting figure. He was about 60 years old at the time. He had owned the pool hall and the barber shop that Curtis Smith had worked in. He had also been involved as a member in earlier rosters in the NAACP in Coffeyville. Curtis Smith had served in the U.S. Army in World War I. Napoleon Anderson had served in the Army during the Spanish-American War. And so you have this act of armed resistance has today been totally forgotten about that represents a significant element in the Black freedom struggle. I say it's totally forgotten about because I visited Coffeyville and no one seemed to remember it at all. There was no memorialization of it. There was nothing in the library or stories about it. After the riot, the various elements of the Kansas National Guard were called in. They occupied the city for 4 days. They had curfew for 4 days, but none of this is remembered. That's what actually blew me away about it.
What happened? How did it unfold after the riot ended?
Okay, so they had, after the riot and the rape, a prosecution of, let's find the suspects. The city hired an investigator who had been formerly with the Anti-Saloon League and the Burns Detective Agency. The African Americans in town put up a reward for finding the suspects, as had the city, as had other entities. And Elisha Scott, who had been involved with the community before because he had argued the case that dealt with the desegregation of the junior high school in Coffeyville in 1924. They knew who he was. His fees were split between the local Coffeyville branch of the NAACP and the national office. The national office was alerted because they had kind of seen the mob, head over, and be fought off.
So who exactly in the end is put on trial for the assault? Is it any of the 3 African American men who were originally questioned?
Well, the surprise came out that about 3 months later, after they had done the investigation, the county attorney, which is what they called the local prosecutor, indicted not any African Americans, but 2 whites. One was Ira Kennedy, the man who had rented that house and who had been a friend of Julia Mooney. And the second was Julia Mooney, one of the victims who had entrapped her friend, Margaret Akers, and set her up to be raped. There was a trial, and there were some very suspicious things about the trial. The jury of all white and all males acquitted, they initially dropped charges against Julia Mooney for lack of evidence. The judge dropped charges. And then the jury had acquitted Ira Kennedy. This caused a lot of consternation in the town. Around 1,000 citizens signed a petition asking the prosecutor to reopen the case, to reopen the investigation. He didn't do so. There's evidence in the correspondence between Elijah Scott and the national office of the NAACP, where he was writing to James Weldon Johnson, the executive secretary, which is what they called in the 1920s, the head of the national office, that the prosecutor had thrown the case. The newspapers at the time said, what is he doing? He's taking the main, his key witness, Margaret Akers, one of the victims, and impeaching her testimony during this trial, criticizing her, finding discrepancies in her story. At the same time, this weird incident occurred just before the trial, where the local prosecutor, C.W. Mitchell, and a jail matron kidnapped their prime witness and took her off to a safe house. Her mother had protested, saying, no, let me go with her. No, we won't let you go with her. She yelled out to the teen boy, call the mayor, tell the mayor what's happening. Well, they took her to this house to try to get her to change her story. And as a result of that teen boy, the mayor showed up at that particular house and rescued her. So you have these things that were going on that are, shall we say, irregularities. And by the way, this happened on a Saturday when we know that municipal government doesn't really function on a Saturday. After this particular trial, there were lawsuits against the city for damages. The lawsuits were from both whites and African Americans who'd been injured in the riot. Those lawsuits were thrown out or were decided against as the fall of the year occurred. And then at the end of the year, when the newspapers put up the kind of reprising of events of the year of 1927, they mentioned Charles Lindbergh, they mentioned the Mississippi flood, but there was nothing about the town having been occupied by the National Guard for 4 days and kept under curfew. There was nothing about the riot. That's one of the things that fascinates me, the erasure of things in history.
In your opinion, why should more people take notice of the Coffeyville Race Riot of 1927?
Here we have an example of armed resistance by African Americans that occurred at the height of Jim Crow, and there's no memory of it. Because the way the trial ended, the girls never received justice. They never had whoever their assailant was sentenced. It was never found out. The prosecutor never proceeded on, despite the petition.
How would you like your article to help shape the historical memory of this event, particularly within Coffeyville itself?
The city of Coffeyville promotes itself as a tourist destination for things such as the city that stopped the Dalton Gang. They had the Condon Bank, and the Condon Bank was restored by the Chamber of Commerce. They have signs all over the city directing you to various places where the shootouts occurred, and the defenders in Coffeyville were able to stop the Dalton Gang. They even marked the graves. But here's the thing. The city has lost the chance, or perhaps it needs to pursue the chance, of memorializing this particular example of armed resistance in the Black freedom struggle. There's a civil rights trail today that is published that leads to various places in the South that were significant in the civil rights struggle of the 1960s. And here we have an example of something that occurred in Kansas a generation earlier, long before the Montgomery bus boycott, long before the freedom rides. long before the sit-downs at lunch counters. This was also long before the Brown v. Board decision. But here's the connection, and the connection is interesting. Elijah Scott had 3 sons. 2 of the sons went into law as lawyers, John Scott and Charles Scott Sr. Those 2 were the initial attorneys in the initial filing of the Topeka parents in Brown v. Board. But like a lot of things, Kansas is not really on the national stage. I mean, yes, it was during the pre-Civil War days, but in a place such as the National Civil Rights Museum, private museum in Memphis, there are documents of the filings signed by Charles Scott and John Scott. There's no plaque telling you who these guys were. Instead, everything focuses on the accomplishments of Thurgood Marshall in getting the Brown decision and becoming a Supreme Court justice. So we're also missing the opportunity to again draw the spotlight to Kansas in some of Kansas history and how it affected the nation overall.
Thank you, Mr. Newman, for coming and talking with us today and enlightening us to the events that happened in Coffeyville in 1927.
I was very glad to be here, Lisa. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. If you would like to learn more about the topics discussed on this podcast, consider becoming a subscriber to our journal, Kansas History, a journal of the Central Plains. Visit our webpage on the Kansas State University's Department of History website to learn how.